So I think there's something, there's further to go, and I think this is the right moment. So for this to happen, I think the media has to recognize its role in responding to the existing status quo and the ideologies of the dominant social and cultural groups. Otherwise, it will not happen, and I think I'll stop at that point.
Now our next speaker is Mr. Dharmakant Jaishi, who is a journalist based in Kathmandu.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I remember my days as a student and school teacher where the last period is always problematic, So it looks like that. I won't take much time, but I think it should leave some time for interaction, at least half an hour. So we have heard about different conflicts right since the morning, and I wouldn't go into the foreground that I have prepared, whether it's Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal. These are the 5 major countries in the region which have faced some kind of prominent conflicts, some over many decades, some in the last decade. I limit my this presentation just to Nepal, and also within that, the latest 2 conflicts that have dominated our discourse, the media writing, the way of life, the policy, and everything else. Like most places in South Asia, we have had this, the Carbon just mentioned the caste. We have had that caste issue, but it's not as prominent or as widespread as in India, at least. We have had this issue of neglect of the far western region, which are very rural areas where hardly, the people still walk for 3 days just to reach the market, even now, even these days. There is this issue of the discrimination against Dalits, the women's rights. Although I think Nepal can proudly claim to have at least 33% representation reserved for women in our parliament. Right since 1996, when the Maoists launched their quote-unquote the People's War for social transformation and economic, prosperity, things just went haywire. We were just heading downhill throughout. And in 2005, when the former king took all the powers, that changed the scenario a lot and actually paved the way for the Maoist and the mainstream political parties, which were at that time called 7 political parties, to come together against the king. And that led to the overthrow of 240-year-old monarchy. So I'm sorry for some of you, this might be very important because you already know, but I just want to go through the background, where we are and what was the journey that we had taken in the last decade or so. And then we had this election in 7 years, the Constituent Assembly election in 2008, and of course the Maoists came as the largest single party, but sort of majority that could allow them to push through their agenda. Now, they had to depend on the other political parties, and that led to actually kind of chaotic situation. It's not just a plain coalition politics. The 2 conflicts that have dominated us, our discourse is this, the post-war transition justice, the way forward that we need to go. And of course the identity politics that came into prominence through 2 mass movements, so the Madhesi movement in 2007 and almost at the same time the movement by Janajatis to assert their identity and their the right. The first conflict, you can say, is still ongoing actually, and until that is resolved, I don't think we can get anywhere near to finding some some answers which are at least acceptable to the most of the people. Now the post-war or the post-conflict transition has actually lingered a lot. We are in the midst of writing a constitution that we should have actually completed by 2010. We failed the deadline. We have already had 3 extensions. Now we are looking into the fourth extension of the Constituent Assembly, which also acts like a parliament, and the constitution is nowhere in the horizon. Now why is that? Among many other issues, the one thing that has actually dogged us is the issue of federalism. Now Nepal is a unitary state, unlike India. But it is already in the constitution, the Indian constitution is marked as a federal state. Now we don't have any federation. We don't have the number now. We don't have the basis for federalizing the country. There are calls for dividing the country on ethnic lines. There are calls to do it on linguistic lines. There are calls for doing that purely on the economic basis. Now where does media figure in all this? Now I am a journalist. There was, I think, some kind of unwritten and conscious effort by and large in the Nepali media not to speak so much about or not to create the discourse or debate on federalism or somehow. And that, of course, I can defend that by saying that we were too much engrossed in how to tackle these Maoist fighters who are living in this 28 cantonments spread throughout Nepal. These are earlier the United Nations was monitoring that. Now there is a special committee under the government that monitors. The whole issue, right since 2006, right since the overthrow of monarchy, the whole focus was on the Maoists, and that has actually dominated. So when the Maoist Prime Minister Prachanda had to leave office, and he claimed that the army, the president had come together to oust him, and he coined the phrase of civilian supremacy, and that was it went on for 9 months actually. So they stopped. So things keep changing, but I think for us in Nepali media, there is no subject that is taboo. At least I can say that with some degree of certainty, whether it's caste, whether it is even LGBT. Media usually champions the causes of these things, and Nepal is one of the few countries that has actually legalized gay marriage, and it has actually incorporated the rights of the transgender in the constitution, and now you have the citizenship certificate with the letter T marked on it, because that was the demand of the community. I'm a bit uncomfortable about media playing a very activist role, because I kind of belong to the old school where I believe the role of the media is to play vigorously, of course, the role of a watchdog, and I agree with Mr. Gautam Navalakha when he said the stringers are vulnerable. And in the case of Nepal, not just the stringers, the reporters who are outside the valley, Kathmandu Valley, the capital, they are much more under severe threat from various groups, armed groups, the Maoists, even from the security personnel. So so when there are times when we have to call the reporter in the field and ask the details which is not in the paper. Sometimes we remove the violence. We resort to various means to the extent possible to protect our reporters who are working and filing the news from the field. And it was really, really very scary during the height of insurgency. That was November 2001 when the state of emergency was imposed, to 2004. That was I think the period when we lost more lives than in the entire 10-year insurgency. There is of course a problem that when I say that activist role, Nepali media has played an activist role, and that was not our choice, by the way. Because when King Ganendra Shah took over power in February 2005, he went after the media. Now that was not the reason that we turned against him. But the thing is that we in the media believe, and this was more or less unanimous voice, whether it was tabloid press, whether it was the mainstream press, electronic media, throughout the country, the king had actually usurped democracy, and we had to fight back. And ultimately, the whole institution had to be abolished. We often face charge of bias. Now that is very, very, I think, natural when there is a conflict going on. The aggrieved party aggrieved individual always accuses you of bias. Now I'll give you one example that when Madhes movement was going on in 2007, Madhes is the belt Tarai which borders India, the southern belt of Nepal. There were accusations of bias against Kathmandu media saying that you are not highlighting our struggle for identity. You are not highlighting the excesses of the security forces. Now, if you look at the coverage of those incidents, they are there. Not as much as we could have. That's because there was complete lack of information, because it was very difficult to move around. There was curfew, of course. There were areas where a Kathmandu-based journalist could not enter Tarai. There was a time for several months that you couldn't go there. If you looked in a certain way, if you had a physical features of a certain community, you couldn't simply go into the area for reportage, because you would be at least definitely beaten. There was no doubt. There was a risk of being killed as well. So those were the factors that did not allow the full and I would say the comprehensive reportage. That was a climate under which most of the Nepali journalists outside Kathmandu operate. When King Tanendra took over, he almost repeated what George Bush has infamously said: either you are with us or with them. And even the king had used the plank of terrorism. I think that it is very difficult to avoid this stamp of biases. It's very unfortunate, but I think it's very inevitable that at times of conflict, it is very difficult to avoid that charge. But what we can do, what we have tried to do is to do as much of reporting, as much of, I won't say neutral reporting, but as much of more in-depth reporting, as much of more field reporting, and that lay the bare facts and allow people, public, to form their own opinion. But at no point of time, I think we should just cross that boundary line and go and become the activist. There are activists who can do that role, who can actually take up the news reportage and then work upon that. So yeah, even in normal time, media has several challenges. When it is actually times of conflict, it is very difficult to work by maintaining your independence, by maintaining your integrity and maintaining your professionalism. But I think these are the three tools that I don't want to sound didactic, but these are the very things that can help media at least fight off some of the charges of biases, which not all the charges are actually true. Thank you.
Let's open the floor for discussion.
I'm a working journalist, so I want to just a couple of observations. Gautam, he also mentioned Vipul, and even just now Damakant has also mentioned about the perception management. He said that about the biasness, just coming back to your thing. The problem we as journalists face in most of the conflict regions is about facts from the government side. So most of the time, what happens is that we are doled out information from non-state actors rather than from the state, and that complicates matters. And often we are charged of being biased by the government. But yes, at personal level, I may be talking to various government or police or army people, but they wouldn't like to be sourced, they wouldn't like to be named. So we as journalists have been taught, because I worked for various news agencies before, so what we were taught is to name the person. But in these cases, in a conflict situation, you are caught in some sort of a catch-22 kind of a situation where you get readily available materials or quotes or information from the militant side, whereas from the government side, it's so perception management per se. If we talk about the Northeast, it is always the militant who scores brownie points rather than the government. So, in my opinion, it's the government was miserably failed and that complicates conflict situations for journalists like us who really depends on one side rather than trying to give both sides a fair play in our stories. So that is to that is the observation to Damakant's where he says that there has been at times you are accused of being biased, or at the same time you can't help it. If you get information from one side, you have to rely on that rather than just letting out the two sides. So that is the biggest challenge I see for journalists working out of conflict situations, especially in the Northeast where you have a myriad of tribal or separatist insurrections going on for almost 5 decades now. Thank you.
Subject changing nature of political discourse and conflicts in South Asia and challenges for media. I'd like to add a little more. It is along with changing nature of political discourse, we should also discuss changing nature of news gathering, content generation and distribution, and the changing nature of media ownership. There was a mention about using advertisement as blocking freedom of press. That's not just in Kashmir. It is happening from Kanyakumari to Kashmir in all the states. And whenever there is a government which wants to teach a lesson to the media or a particular newspaper or a television channel, they use this, disproportionately increase or decrease. Second thing is, all these days media or journalistic institutions were under the control of people who loved the field of journalism. Now the media ownership pattern is changing. International, multinational, corporate companies are buying up media houses one by one, and many of them are entertainment companies. And second thing is, government used to be the biggest advertiser all these years, and that role is being taken over by the corporate companies. And corporate companies, once they have the ownership of media, they will definitely use the media as an add-on tool to improve their corporate image. That is the data. And second thing is, what kind of a content generation news gathering is taking place. All these days, Google, that is the biggest agency in the country, they denied that they were going to be a news producing house. They said we are only service providers like the post offices. We just deliver it from people to people. But now their intention is very clear. Very soon they will be a news producing house. Imagine, we worry about right to privacy. Starting from our SMS to whatever transpires in the digital network, there is no privacy. I can erase it in my window, but their server keeps it all the time. And for Google, all these years we are discussing media as under a political control. Now once Google becomes a news producer, and they will have no control of anybody, and once these people are dependent on other advertisement sources, they will not worry about any government source. Now second thing is, what is happening inside media houses? All these days the impression was that the editor is the big man. Now in most of the media houses, editor is the 15th or 16% salary wise and power wise. At the end of the newspaper, you see the printer's bylaws. The person responsible, morally, legally, emotionally responsible, whatever appears in the printed newspaper. But I tell you, 80% of the matter that gets into the newspaper under the editor's headline, he won't even get an opportunity to read it, forget knowing what it is. Then the response connecting initiatives, the editor does not get a chance to see it. And then all the other extra supplements, it's under the control of the vice president response. And the meetings and decisions are held by the CEOs, not editors anymore. Once the cooperative companies take over this kind of a control, let's imagine what happens. And the changing ownership pattern and the content generation, news gathering will become a bigger problem for all democratic communities. There's another thing happening. I have a niece who was 13 years old, and when I was editor of Times of India, she called me up in the evening around 7:38. Said, "Uncle, I want to talk to you, I have a problem." I said, "I know what's your problem. You must have made a boyfriend and your mother has come to know about it." He says, "Don't be stupid. I don't have time to waste for this immature boys. My problem is more serious than that." I said, "Okay, tell me what is." He said, "This morning My dad, who is working for an IT company, had forgotten his laptop at home. Out of curiosity, I opened.